In the dry hills of northwestern New Mexico, there's a place where 5-story stone buildings have stood empty for 8 centuries. The walls are still straight, the rooms are still aligned to the sun. Nobody has lived there since the Middle Ages in Europe. For generations, the people who study this place told a comforting story. A gentle farming society had built something remarkable in the desert, then, for reasons nobody could explain, packed up and disappeared into thin air. It was taught in schools as one of history's great unsolved riddles. That comforting story is no longer true. Over the last 15 years, scientists have pulled genetic material out of bones buried in these ruins for 1,000 years. And what that genetic material said did not match the story in the textbooks. It knocked out the foundation of almost everything people believed about who built this place, why they built it, and what actually happened to them. The people who lived here were never a simple, equal farming community. And they did not disappear. Both of those ideas turn out to be wrong, and the truth that replaces them is far stranger and far darker than the old legend ever was. The place is called Chaco Canyon, a narrow, dry cut of sandstone in the high desert of New Mexico. There is no major river running through it, no forest, no easy water supply, nothing about the landscape that explains why anyone would choose to build a capital there. Yet somewhere around the year 850, small farming settlements in this canyon began to grow into something else entirely. Within a few generations, this dusty, waterless canyon had become the center of a network of communities, spread across an area bigger than Ireland. At the heart of it were what archaeologists now call great houses, more than 150 of them scattered across the region. These were not simple pueblos. Some rose 5 stories high. Some contained more than 600 rooms under one roof. The stonework is so precise that modern masons who study it still cannot fully explain how it was achieved without metal tools or wheels. These buildings were not placed randomly either. Their walls and corners were positioned to track the movement of the sun and moon, not just across a single year, but across cycles that took decades to complete. A spiral of carved lines on a nearby rock face catches a dagger of sunlight at exactly noon on the summer solstice, engineering so precise it could only be the work of people who had studied the sky for generations. Then there are the roads. Long, wide, perfectly straight roads radiate outward from the canyon, some running for over 100 miles. They are far wider than needed for foot traffic, since there were no wheeled carts and no pack animals large enough to justify the width. They do not curve around obstacles the way a practical trail would. They go straight up cliffs using carved stairways, rather than bending around them. Whoever built these roads was making a statement, carving a kind of order onto the land itself. At the center of every great house sat a circular sunken chamber, dug partly into the earth, some small, some large enough to hold hundreds of people. These were the ceremonial hearts of the community, gathering spaces where rituals were repeated generation after generation. For nearly 300 years, this entire system functioned as the most advanced, most tightly coordinated society anywhere north of central Mexico. Then, within a few generations, it all stopped. Not through fire, not through war, not through any obvious disaster visible in the ruins. The people simply left. The great houses, still standing, still full of ceremonial objects, turquoise and painted pottery, were abandoned. The roads fell silent. For a long time, that abandonment was treated as archaeology's great unsolved mystery of North America. The answer that filled that gap for most of the 20th century felt reassuring. The people of Chaco, given the borrowed name Anasazi, were imagined as peaceful farmers living in near-perfect harmony with each other and the land. No kings, no hierarchy, no violence, just sun worship, corn, and community. When they eventually left, historians guessed it was drought, or soil exhaustion, or some quiet, dignified dispersal into the wider desert. The problem is that almost none of that story was built from direct evidence about the people themselves. It was built from pottery styles and wall alignments, and a fair amount of hopeful guessing. The actual skeletal remains of the people who lived and died in Chaco Canyon sat untouched in storage for 100 years, because the technology to read the information locked inside those bones did not exist yet. That changed with ancient DNA analysis, a method that let scientists extract fragments of genetic material preserved in old bones and compare them against genomes of people living today. When researchers finally applied this method to remains from Chaco Canyon in the 2010s, the peaceful, equal, mysteriously vanished narrative did not survive. The first major discovery came from Pueblo Bonito, the largest of all the great houses. Inside one particular burial chamber, researchers had already noted an unusual concentration of wealth. Thousands of pieces of turquoise, rare shell trumpets carried from the Pacific coast, finely woven mats. When the DNA results came back, they explained why this room was so different. The individuals buried there across roughly 300 years were biologically related to one another through their mothers, in an unbroken line across 9 generations. This was not a democratic farming village. This was a hereditary ruling family, a dynasty that had controlled the most important religious and political space in the canyon for centuries, and had been laying its dead to rest in that same private chamber the entire time. The old picture of a classless, egalitarian society collapsed the moment this result was published. Chaco had rulers. Chaco had bloodlines that mattered more than others. But that finding was only the first surprise. The second one was stranger, and it eventually rewrote the entire narrative of what Chaco actually was. When scientists compared the genetic profile of the Chaco elite to the wider population of the ancient Southwest, most results lined up as expected. But within Chaco Canyon itself, especially among the highest status burials, there was something extra, a genetic signature that did not belong to the local population at all. Something had entered the gene pool of Chaco's ruling class from somewhere outside the Southwest entirely, and it had gone straight into the most powerful family in the canyon. A sudden, localized genetic signal like that almost always points to one thing: people moving in from elsewhere and establishing themselves in power, and the timing matched almost exactly with the explosive transformation of Chaco from a modest cluster of farming settlements into the most architecturally ambitious society in the region. To pin down where the signal came from, researchers looked at trade goods that began appearing in Chaco around this same period. Bright feathers from tropical macaws, a bird that does not live anywhere near New Mexico. Copper bells crafted using metallurgy techniques developed far to the south. Chemical traces of cacao found inside ceremonial drinking vessels, a plant that only grows in tropical lowlands hundreds of miles away. Every piece of physical evidence pointed toward central Mexico, a region that in the 9th century was collapsing, its great cities emptying, its old power structures fracturing, sending its elites searching for new territory. At almost the same moment, Chaco Canyon began its transformation, and the architectural clues line up with startling precision. At a site called Wupatki, on the western edge of the Chaco world, archaeologists found an actual Mesoamerican-style ball court, the kind used for centuries in ritual games across central Mexico. Nothing like it existed anywhere else in the ancient Southwest. Inside Chaco Canyon itself, at a great house called Chetro, builders constructed a row of columns along one wall, styled closely after temple architecture found in central Mexico. Later, someone filled those columns in with stone, as if the foreign styling had become something to hide. Then came a smaller but telling detail. In one of the elite graves inside Pueblo Bonito, researchers found a tooth deliberately filed and shaped in a decorative pattern common across Mesoamerica for centuries, and never documented anywhere else in the ancient Southwest. The only way that tooth ends up in that grave is if the person had grown up somewhere far to the south and later been buried among Chaco's ruling elite. Put together, the picture became hard to avoid. Sometime around the year 900, a small number of people from the collapsing societies of central Mexico traveled north into New Mexico's canyon country. They arrived carrying specialized knowledge: how to build monumental stone architecture, how to track the sky with precision, how to organize religious and political authority around a ruling class. Within a handful of generations, the farming settlements of Chaco transformed into a coordinated, powerful theocratic center. Scientists cannot say exactly how many people made that original journey. Based on the strength of the genetic signal, the number was likely small, perhaps a few dozen, maybe even a single founding family. But they arrived and placed themselves immediately at the top, then built something on that foundation the region had never seen before. This detail alone breaks the old peaceful farmer narrative. A loosely organized, equal farming community does not spontaneously reorganize itself into a rigid theocracy with monumental architecture within a couple of generations. The model at Chaco increasingly resembles a smaller, transplanted version of the Mesoamerican religious state. A ruling class holding specialized knowledge, a strict hierarchy, and monumental building meant to express dominance over land and people. But the belief systems that traveled north with that ruling class were not limited to architecture and astronomy. They carried a much darker religious tradition, one built around ritual bloodshed, and for decades, most researchers were reluctant to say that out loud about Chaco. One physical anthropologist spent much of his career forcing the field to confront it anyway. His name was Christy Turner. Before studying ancient bones, he had worked as a forensic consultant assisting police in homicide investigations, which gave him a specific skill. He knew what human bones looked like after a peaceful death, and what they looked like after violence and deliberate processing. And when Turner examined skeletal remains from Chaco and its surrounding communities, he noticed something that did not fit any conventional burial practice. These bones were broken, burned, and scattered in patterns that closely matched how animal bones look after being butchered for food. Over decades, he developed a strict checklist requiring at least 6 specific indicators before he would label remains as evidence of cannibalism. Those indicators were precise. Burning concentrated on the back of the skull rather than the face. A scraping pattern called anvil abrasion, left when bone is smashed open between 2 stones for marrow. Cut marks made by stone tools positioned exactly at the joints. A fine glassy polish left on fragments stirred inside ceramic pots. fracture patterns consistent with breaking fresh bone rather than old, weathered bone, and the near total absence of vertebrae which contain rich marrow and had been thoroughly smashed in nearly every case. Applying this checklist across dozens of Chaco-linked sites, Turner and his colleagues identified close to 300 individuals whose remains met every one of these criteria. Men, women, children, and infants, processed the same way Chacan communities processed deer and rabbit. For years, many researchers argued this still did not prove actual consumption, only butchering. That gap between proof of processing and proof of eating defined the debate for more than 2 decades. The gap closed in 1997 at a site in southwestern Colorado called Cowboy Wash. Archaeologists found the remains of 7 individuals, all matching Turner's full checklist. Near the cooking hearth, they also found preserved human waste, dried and well kept by the desert climate. A biochemist named Richard Marlar tested it for a specific protein called human myoglobin, found only in human skeletal muscle, and never present in the digestive tract, unless a person has eaten another person's muscle tissue. Marlar ran the test repeatedly, in triplicate, over several weeks, with every control he could think of. Every result came back positive. This was no longer circumstantial. It was direct chemical proof of cannibalism. Once this result was accepted, the wider pattern across the Chaco region snapped into focus. Roughly 1 in 50 sets of skeletal remains from Chacan sites met the full forensic definition, and around 90% of them clustered in or near the major ceremonial great houses, the exact centers of religious and political power. The timing lined up too. This pattern appears in the record almost exactly when Chaco's rise begins, and disappears almost exactly when Chaco's power collapses. There is no evidence of widespread warfare or famine to explain it. This was happening during relative agricultural abundance, concentrated specifically around the seats of authority, pointing towards something deliberate rather than desperate. Piecing together the genetic, architectural, dental, and forensic evidence, researchers arrived at one coherent explanation. A small elite group carrying traditions from the collapsing societies of central Mexico arrived in Chaco in the late 9th century, bringing architectural styles, astronomical knowledge, and a religious framework in which ritualized violence, including consumption of human flesh by priests, functioned as the ultimate demonstration of power. This system did not require a large following to work. It needed only a small, disciplined ruling class and a population conditioned to comply out of fear. In this reading, the ancestral Puebloan people, living under Chaco's influence, were never the ones carrying out these acts by choice. They were living beneath a ruling class that had imported a system of religious terror from 1,000 miles away and used it to hold power for nearly 3 centuries. This also explains a strange detail in the bones. The evidence does not show a community routinely eating its own dead. It shows sudden, intense, highly specific events. Entire families processed at once, children alongside parents, bodies deliberately left in plain view inside the most sacred spaces, where word could travel quickly to surrounding villages. The purpose was almost certainly symbolic, not nutritional. A small number of brutal, unmistakable acts at the religious center of the region was enough to enforce obedience across dozens of communities without needing constant repetition. This is also where the story needs real care. Descendant Puebloan communities, including the Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, and the Rio Grande Pueblo peoples, have pushed back against this interpretation for decades, and their concerns deserve to be heard. They point out, correctly, that cannibalism accusations have historically been used to dehumanize indigenous peoples. They argue that forensic evidence alone cannot capture the full meaning of events from 1,000 years ago. And they insist that whatever violence occurred happened to their ancestors, not because of who their ancestors were. That distinction matters, and remarkably, it lines up with what the evidence actually shows. The genetic markers, the imported architecture, the dental modification, the chemical proof from the coprolite, all of it points to the same conclusion the descendant communities have voiced for generations. The violence at Chaco was not a feature of Puebloan culture. It was imposed on Puebloan communities by a small, foreign ruling class using a borrowed and brutal religious system to hold power for roughly 2.5 centuries. The Chaco world was never held together by consent. It was held together by fear, and systems built on fear always carry an expiration date. That expiration date arrived around the middle of the 12th century, and when it did, the structure came apart from several directions at once. The first pressure came from the climate. Tree ring analysis across the southwest, which allows researchers to reconstruct rainfall year by year going back over 1,000 years, shows that the stable climate sustaining Chacan agriculture broke down sharply during this period. Starting around 1130 and continuing for roughly 50 years, the region entered a severe, prolonged drought. Rainfall patterns that had allowed farmers to grow corn in soil and elevations that should never have supported it began failing season after season. Chaco Canyon was especially vulnerable since it had no dependable water source of its own. Its great houses and ceremonial centers had only ever been sustainable through a constant, coordinated flow of food from outlying farming communities. When those communities could no longer produce enough surplus, the religious and political core began to starve, and the network that had once commanded loyalty across hundreds of square miles began to contract. The second signal shows up directly in the bones. The pattern of processed, cannibalized remains, present for well over 2 centuries, begins to vanish almost exactly when the drought begins. The latest assemblages matching Turner's full checklist cluster tightly around the decades near 1150. After roughly 1180, that pattern essentially disappears from the record entirely, not gradually, but abruptly. What caused that system to end so suddenly is something the physical evidence cannot answer with certainty. Perhaps the local population finally rose against the ruling elite. Perhaps the priests lost their authority once the promised order failed to hold during the drought. Perhaps the whole system simply collapsed under the weight of a failing food supply. What is clear is that within a few decades of the drought's arrival, the great houses were being abandoned, not burned, not destroyed by war, simply left standing empty, exactly as they still appear today. By around 1200, the canyon's population was shrinking rapidly. By 1250, the outlying communities tied into the Chaco network were emptying too. By 1300, the wider Four Corners region, once home to one of the most advanced societies north of central Mexico, was essentially empty of permanent settlement. This is exactly where the old textbook version of the story always stopped. The vanishing, the great unsolved mystery, the silent ruins. And this is precisely where that version has always been wrong, because the depopulation of Chaco Canyon was never a disappearance. It was a migration. The people who had lived under Chacuan rule, who had endured whatever had actually taken place inside those great houses, did not vanish. They moved south and east, following rivers that still carried water even as the climate dried, down toward the Rio Grande and the Little Colorado, into fertile valleys where farming was still possible. They carried with them the accumulated knowledge of agriculture, astronomy, and masonry that had defined their ancestors' world. What they left behind were the ceremonial centers of a theocratic system that had, by then, stopped being worth preserving. From here, the archaeological trail on its own goes quiet. For the following 6 centuries, the true story of where these people went was preserved almost entirely through the oral traditions of their descendants. Traditions that mainstream researchers largely dismissed as folklore rather than treating as historical evidence in their own right. What ancient DNA research has now done, through studies completed over roughly the last decade, is confirm with hard genetic evidence exactly what those oral traditions had been saying all along. The people who built Chaco Canyon never actually disappeared. Their direct descendants have been living in the same region, in plain sight, the entire time, in the Pueblo communities of New Mexico and Arizona that trace their lineage back to the people who once filled those great houses with life. The real question was never where these people went. The real question is why so many people spent over a century convinced they had gone anywhere at all. A civilization was labeled lost, while its living descendants continued farming the same valleys, practicing many of the same ceremonies, and carrying, quite literally, the same ancestry as the people who built those 5-story stone monuments in the desert. The oral histories had been telling this story accurately for 800 years. It was outside researchers who spent most of that time refusing to listen. Ancient DNA did not discover a lost people. It simply confirmed what had never actually been forgotten in the first place, except by those who arrived later and decided the story needed a tidy, mysterious ending. The true mystery buried in the sandstone of Chaco Canyon was never really about what happened to the people who built it. It is about how long it took everyone else to finally notice they had never actually left.